Okay, well, it's noon, so let's get started with our webinar. I'll begin today by welcoming all of you to this webinar sponsored by the American Mathematical Society. My name is Tom Barr. I'm the Director of Programs at AMS, but I'm very glad to be here and welcome you and introduce our presenter today. I'll mention, I guess, before we get started, that we are recording the proceedings here, so that will be available later on. We'll be doing Q&A through the chat, and I will be monitoring that. Every so often, we may pause, and I'll transmit some of those to our presenter, and we'll be engaged in conversation that way. So the title of today's webinar is How Do I Build My EdTech Toolbox? Our presenter is Dr. Patrice Prusco. She's Associate Director for Learning, Design, Technology, and Media in the Harvard Graduate School of Education. In that role, she oversees design and development and management of online technology-enhanced courses in HGSE. The objectives in this work are the creation of courses that are inclusive and designed for diverse student populations. Previously, she's worked as an instructional designer at Cornell's Center for Teaching Innovation, and she has served as a faculty member at the State University of New York, Empire State College. So I believe we have, I'm going to click and admit a few other folks here. I believe that takes care of most of our logistics and introductions. So without further ado, I turn things over to Dr. Prusco.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And welcome, everyone. I'm excited to talk with you today about building community in your online course and thinking about how to use technology in your course. So for our agenda, one of the things I just wanted to highlight is we'll start this discussion really by focusing on what are the things that you really need to be thinking about before you select your technology, and highlighting the different pedagogical considerations that you need to make, and trying to keep the focus on thinking about this, what will most enhance the learner experience, what makes the most sense for your pedagogical goals and best meets your needs. And we will then, throughout the presentation, we'll have an opportunity to try a few different tools. One of the things I would like to mention that most of you probably know, there are countless numbers of tools out there. So I will highlight just a few, but I won't be going into detail on the how-tos as far as how to set up tools or the functionality of them. It'll be more of a discussion around thinking about, how you might want to use a tool and when you might want to use one over the other. And as Tom mentioned, we'll pause throughout for Q&A. And my preference always is to have an interactive session. So please include as many questions as you have in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So one of the things that I always encourage people to start with when thinking about a synchronous session is including norms. And some people like to brainstorm those norms with people in the class, or you can start with a set. It's really important, especially for students, to know what your expectations are. And I share the image. I am a cat lover as well as dogs, so I especially like this image. But it's important that you communicate, especially now, what your expectations are for students, how you expect them to show up. And as you're thinking about those expectations, to keep in mind the lived experiences our students have. And I know at the School of Education, we have been fully online this entire year. And that means that we have students all across the globe. So we have students who are living at home with their parents, or they have small children, or their house is a mess. There are many different reasons that someone may not want to have a camera on. And so I think that is something that you want to think about in your norms, is whether you want to require a camera to be on or give students that option of having it off. And if it is off, to clearly communicate other ways that students can show that they're engaged. And I also encourage people, when thinking about norms, to think about things like how you want the chat box used. In Zoom specifically, you can set the chat up so that students have the option of only posting to the host, or asking a question to everybody, being able to direct message people. Some people find it distracting when there's a lot of side conversation going on. So you do have the ability also to make those changes during a session. So if there is a point when you only want them to be able to ask the host a technical question or something like that, and other times when you actually want them to be having a discussion. As you noticed at the beginning, Tom mentioned that the session is being recorded. The text at the bottom of the screen is just an example. It is important that you let students know a session is being recorded, and that could be another reason they may want to have their cameras turned off. And I would also encourage you to check with your university and school about any requirements they have about recording students and how that content is being shared. So when we think about building community in a classroom where we're all face to face, most of us, if we've been teaching in a classroom for a long time, we have a pretty good idea of what that looks like and feels like. But when we start to think about our students being all across the globe, especially if it's the first time we've been teaching online, a lot of times people have a hard time imagining what that is going to feel like. How do we cultivate those relationships and really help students build, really build those relationships of trust? And how are we going to ensure those outcomes that we've so successfully done in the classroom? So this is a picture that I like to share. And as you can see, it is a picture of an old classroom, and from many years ago, but of course, many of our classrooms still look like this. And to me, this picture really visualizes the fact that, just because we're all sitting in the same space does not mean that we're engaged. It does not mean we have a sense of belonging. It does not mean that we feel a sense of community. And on the other side of that, just because we are all in separate spaces connected by Zoom or whatever the technology is that you're using, does not mean that we can't feel those things. And whether you have a small class of 10 or a class of 100 or 500 students, there are many ways that we can think about how we might design situations and experiences where students can have meaningful discourse and really get to know you and their peers. And those are some of the things that we will be touching on today. So next we are going to do a word cloud. And this is where I always preface, even for those of us that have been using technology for years and years, it doesn't always work. So this word cloud was created using Poll Everywhere. And if you have your phone and you're comfortable, you can text to the number 22333. And then in the content for that text, to put in the Patrice Torcy 736. And I just want to note that before the number 7, that is a letter I. So it's PATRICETORCI, and then the number 736. And if you prefer, you can also go to your web browser to the polleverywhere.com. And I did put a few examples in to show that you can also use emojis. And a word cloud like this, it's a great way to check in with your students at the start of class and get a sense of how they're feeling. It's also a way that you can check in to see how they're feeling about the content or an exam you just had, different things like that. And I will add that Poll Everywhere, in addition to word clouds, it does have several other different types of polls that you can use. And I'm going to pause just right now to see if there were any questions or anything that has come up so far. Okay, great. So we can see some common themes coming up. It's good to see that some people are feeling excited and happy. So before we move on, I always like to touch a little bit on tools and rules. And these are things that you should have in the back of your mind as you're thinking about technology. And we talked a little bit in the beginning about always thinking about, what is the pedagogical intention? And I know we hear about new technology every day, or we are on social media and we hear about something really interesting that somebody's doing. And it's really easy to jump on the next shiny object and thing that just seems like it is going to miraculously solve whatever problem you're having or trying to overcome. And it's also depending upon whether you are at K through 12, type school, or undergrad or graduate. Free tools can also seem very appealing depending upon what your budget is. And so I would like to highlight and stress that if you are thinking about exploring new technology, to always check the accessibility and make sure that it meets the most recent accessibility requirements. And also that you check in with, if you have an IT department or a teaching and learning center or whoever you might work with when thinking about technology, to check in with them to see, what the accessibility requirements are for your institution or school. And in addition to digital accessibility, we also have been thinking a lot about geographic accessibility. So as I mentioned, our students this year are all across the globe. And many of our students, for example, were in China. And we found that a lot of our tools were not accessible to students in China. And a lot of our faculty, for example, like to use Google Docs, which I think many of us use. And that is not accessible in China. Many of our faculty like to use YouTube videos. That's another thing that's not accessible. So it is really important that you think about geographic accessibility as far as the types of tools you're selecting. And you can work with your library as well if there are videos and things that you are interested in sharing, and see if there are any other alternatives to that. And also keeping in mind time zone and being what we like to refer to as time zone resilient. If you are holding synchronous sessions, to think about where your students are located in the different time zones they are, and whether it's possible to hold a session, for example, in the morning and in the evening, or hold sessions at different times of day. And the other things just to keep in mind when we think about accessibility are things, for example, right now I'm on the East Coast and it's lunchtime, so I might say good afternoon. But it could be that for some of my students, it is 11 p.m. at night. And so just keeping some things like that in mind. I also encourage you, when you are looking at new tools, to think about things like data privacy and security. Some, especially free tools, they, for example, could be using students' email to sell to marketers and then sending them different types of advertisement. You also have to think about who owns that content, especially at the graduate level. There are a lot of FERPA requirements around content that's graded. So again, your IT office is a great place to go to for information around things like that. And before I move on, I was just wondering if anyone had any questions on accessibility or anything like that. Okay. And one other thing I would like to mention before we move on to talk a little bit more about the community of inquiry, that I'd like to stress, and we'll talk a little bit about that in this session, is the importance of having a backup plan. For example, what happens if you have a Zoom session and you can't log in? How are you going to communicate that to your students? What happens if Canvas is down and your students have an assignment? What is the protocol for them? Or on the other side, if they have an internet problem, what is the protocol for them to let you know? And I will be sharing out some resources, and as part of that, I'll share out some documentation that we've created that lists out some ideas for having a backup plan for both of those things. So I'd like to move in now to talk a little bit about community of inquiry, which is what we think about when we are thinking about community in the online classroom. And when we think about community of inquiry, there are really three major aspects to it: social presence, cognitive presence, and teaching presence. And to really have, for students to have the best possible educational experience, all three of those really need to work together. And so as we're thinking about different activities and ways of building community, we always like to come back to this and think about, are we touching on all three of these pieces, and how are they interacting together? And I'd also like to highlight that when we think of teaching presence, some of you, if you are familiar with this framework, you may also see it as teacher presence or instructor presence. I always like to focus on teaching presence because the instructor is not the only one that does teaching. We really, especially if we have a student-centered experience, we like to incorporate peer learning and give students opportunities to take on that role as well. And when we think about a student-centered experience and the type of experience that we really want to create so that our students feel supported, we really want to think from a lens of empathy, care, flexibility, and clarity. And so as we start to think about building community, I'd like you to keep these pieces really at the forefront of your mind. And think about empathy, as we're selecting tools, for example, trying to understand, what is the student experience? Are they going to have access to this tool? Do they have bandwidth issues where it might interfere with their ability to participate in the session? And when we think about creating a caring environment, flexibility really is part of that. I think especially now, really trying to be cognizant of, like, in what ways can you be flexible with your students, again, while still ensuring that they meet the outcomes for your course. And the framework that I built with some colleagues at the School of Ed, that really stems from the community of inquiry, is really thinking about, how can we make sure that the experiences that we are creating are active, engaging, focused on community building, and caring and humanizing. And so those four values really drive everything that I do and everything that I'm going to talk about today. Is there a question?
Oh, no. Okay. At this point.
And when thinking about instructional support, I wasn't sure, if what the mix of people would be, if some are on the teaching side, some in teaching and learning, or staff. But it's great to have multiple types of support available. And there are a lot of different types of online teaching short courses that are available, but also within your institution, it can be helpful if you have access to that or you have the ability to create one. And we've found it to be really successful having things like brown bag sessions, peer and peer learning communities. And if you have the opportunity to have that at your school or institution, those can be extremely, extremely beneficial. Just having that space to share some ideas and learn together. And many places may or may not have individual consultations. And I know one of the pluses, ultimately a plus, but that has come out of our transition to suddenly needing to be fully online is suddenly everybody knows that there's a teaching and learning center on their campus and that there's learning design or hopefully learning design and instructional design support available for you. And so I do encourage you, if you have those resources, reach out to them, reach out to your library. The instructional staff is there to help you and support you. So one of the values that I touched on was caring and creating a caring and humanizing experience. And when I think about that, especially most recently, I think it's important to keep in mind trauma-informed instruction. And a lot of that involves just helping learners feel safe and connected. So some of the things that we're going to talk about today are ways that you can, help your students feel connected to you and feel connected to others in their classroom. And giving them options to contact you individually or contact other TFs or teaching assistants or whoever you might have helping you in the classroom is especially important. And there are a number of resources that I will be sharing around trauma-informed instruction. But what I mentioned earlier about like having, allowing students, for example, to not have the camera on it has to do with this framework of trauma-informed instruction and really having empathy and thinking about, what is the experience of my student right now and where are they at and how can I best support them? And always thinking about equity in your class. There are now a lot of anti-racist teaching resources available. And one of the things that we also have been thinking about as we think about technology is through that lens when we think especially about data collection and AI. And if a tool, for example, is using AI and it's collecting data on the students who are the majority, are we further marginalizing other students? So again, as you're thinking about technology, I encourage you to always think about equity and how, in the situation of your students. So one of the reasons that, of course, we think about using different types of technology in the classroom is the idea of active learning. And I think one of the spaces that has been difficult for some people in the teaching space is you're used to being in the classroom and maybe writing on the whiteboard and having students in small groups and doing different activities like that. And when you're in the online space, it can be difficult to think about what is that going to look and feel like in this space. And so when you think about that, so some of the things that we're going to do today, for example, like using breakout rooms, using different types of polls, incorporating Google Docs, those are different ways to allow students to be active and interact with each other. And we usually do encourage, not if you are having, for example, a 60-minute live session, that you incorporate different types of active learning opportunities every 10 to 15 minutes to allow students to have that interactivity and also to allow them time to reflect on what you're learning, on what they're learning. And in thinking about engaging an engaging community, a lot of times we forget that we do have a whole community outside of our classroom. And something that I've found especially successful is inviting in guest speakers to talk with the class, or doing things like, especially now, like maybe you can't go out to see something, but doing something like a virtual tour. And when I think about mathematics, especially, and trying to engage, especially underrepresented students in the mathematics field, something that I've talked with a lot of our faculty about is bringing in different people to talk about their careers and their career path. And if you're able to bring in a diverse group of people doing that, there are a couple of different ways you could approach it. You could have them create a short video, and this video could be incorporated into an asynchronous discussion. And that whoever your guest speaker is could be a guest in that asynchronous discussion and participate in the Q&A. You could also have a guest speaker, of course, join a live synchronous session as well as this. And I am wondering, if anyone has any ideas or things that you've done to build engagement around community or active learning in your classroom. I would love if you would share those in the chat box with others. So the next thing that we're going to do is go into breakout rooms for a pair discussion. And I'm going to randomly put you into the breakout rooms. And I'd like you to think back to a time when you felt a sense of community. And it could either be in a face-to-face or online setting. And really think about, what did that look like? And what did it feel like when you really felt that sense of community? And, then try to think about, what does community in a classroom look like to your learners? I'm wondering if anyone would like to share anything they talked about as far as what community feels like to you. And you can raise your hand or turn on your microphone if you'd like to share. And if you would prefer to share in the chat, that works as well. Okay.
Rebecca Gwynn has her hand up.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Oh, hi. I was going to say that in my group, we talked a little bit about the whole idea of the asynchronous environment and how we were able to develop our sense of community and our own through the office hour meetings that we had. And we also discussed how it was a little bit more difficult when the students didn't email or respond back to you when you put out put out ways for them to communicate. They just did the work, that you didn't feel as connected to those students, even though they were doing the work, but because they didn't engage with you through either chat or email, you felt like, okay, they're in the class, but I don't know anything about it. I don't really know that student.
Yeah, Fatima, to echo what you were saying, we said something similar, that we feel in a community when, or at least I do, when I get feedback from the students, and I know that I'm being heard, and that I want them to know that their voice is also being heard. And so one of the things that we talked about was how sometimes that takes multiple attempts. And the first time we asked students to respond, and the second time they were really timid. And by the time they realize, no, we really mean it, we want to know their concerns, then it makes me feel more like I'm in a community with them when I know that they're participating and they're hearing me and they're watching my little weekly videos that I'm posting, or whatever it is. But that it takes a lot of attempts for them to be, I guess, brave enough to engage in that.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. I think that's a really important point, that just because something doesn't work the first time doesn't mean that it has failed. Sometimes you have to try a couple of times. And I've also heard, from a lot of times the faculty or teacher's perception is different than the student experience. And so sometimes the students are connecting and building community, and you may not see that. You may not realize that like all the things that you are doing are helping them create relationships, and they may be finding their own ways to connect and build that community. And I just wanted to highlight, I saw Ellen noted that having students be able to emit when they have no idea what's going on. And yes, I think that is definitely a sign that you've created a space where students really feel safe. So I'm going to launch a Zoom poll next. So the question is, which of the following have you tried? Whiteboard, polls, annotation, discussion, or self-recorded video? Okay, so it looks like people have tried a lot of different tools, especially the whiteboards, discussion, and self-recorded video, which makes sense. And we will talk a little bit about annotation tools coming up. Okay, so let me just share my screen again.
I have one more thing that we talked about.
Yep.
We also talked about doing collaborative documents, and in the group as a way of collaborating. And I think it's Professor Southey, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right. She brought up the fact that she would do collaborative projects that enable her to get her students to engage with each other.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And one of the things, there are a couple different ways you can do collaborative projects. I think Google Docs work really well, as well as one of the things that we've been working on is using Office 365 instead, because it does have that geographic access, although it's not as user-friendly as Google Docs is. And there is a collaborative tool that I'm going to show you next, and it's called Padlet, which some of you may have used. And so on the Padlet screen, you can see that I've posted a couple of different questions, and I'm going to put a link to this in the chat box so that people can add to it. But this works really well if you want. There are a couple different ways that you can use Padlet. It's a great way if students have a final project for them to share a link to their final project. And then you can see that students can either, you can set it up so that they can vote up different things, or they can like different things, and they can comment. So it can be a way also to do peer review and different types of peer feedback. It also works well for brainstorming. In the beginning, we talked about setting norms. Sometimes I'd like to use a Padlet as a way for people to think about setting norms. Or if you have students who are in a team and they need to set norms for their team as well. And if anyone here has used Padlet or Post-it notes or anything like that, and you wanted to share how you've used it. And I'm going to put the link in the Padlet in case people want to add something to that. And you just click on the plus at the bottom, and then you can type something in if you want to type a new square, or you can comment on the ones that I already have in there. Okay, and Sarah said she would love to use whiteboards more often. So what I've found with whiteboards, so if you're in a Zoom session, of course, the Zoom whiteboard is the easiest one to use. And I'll just show that one right now. And it has just basic functionality. And if you scroll on your menu and you click on annotate, you should be able to draw on this whiteboard. So it allows you to do text and numbers, to draw, to erase, but that really is about it. One of the things that we've found is there is no whiteboard tool that fully meets accessibility requirements. So I do encourage you, if you are using a whiteboard, that you describe what you're doing on the whiteboard as you're writing out what you're doing. And also the same would apply if you're using, for example, you're doing some sort of screen recording and you're writing on a whiteboard. It's really helpful from an accessibility standpoint to actually be describing what it is that that you're writing out. And there are as I said earlier, there are many different types of tools. Miro is a tool that a lot of people really like. And that actually allows you to use things like Post-it notes and emojis and different things like that. And I can share a link and add that to the resources as well. And the other thing I wanted to mention in Zoom is if you put students in small groups, they have access to a whiteboard. So they could be working out a homework problem or something like that in a small group. And then you do have the option to save the whiteboard as a PDF. So if the students want to save what they worked on, they can save that. And before we go on, does anyone have any whiteboard questions? Oh, one other thing I will mention is you can, if you have an iPad, you can buy a stylus for your iPad, which makes it much easier to write with. Or there are different things like a Wacom tablet and different types of tablets that come with a stylus that you can use.
We've got some suggestions from a number of folks about tools that work for this.
Great. Yeah, no, writing is not easy on here. that is for sure. Okay. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing that. So one of the other things that I would like to show you is a tool called Perusal, which is an annotation tool. And there are a number of different types of annotation tools, of course, that are available. And you'll find that each annotation tool has its own benefits and limitations. One of the things that I really like about Perusal is that it allows you to annotate PDFs. And another thing that I actually just learned is they also, there's also a library of textbooks associated with Perusal, so that if your students buy the textbook through Perusal, they can actually annotate in the textbook. And when I was getting ready for this session, I noticed that many of the textbooks now are actually being offered to students for free, so that they can have free access to the textbook and then be able to annotate in it. And so this is just an example that I found where an instructor had students annotating a proof that is actually in the textbook. And again, this is a great way for asynchronous collaboration and to have students be able to do that, what we talked about earlier, that teaching presence, where they might be answering questions for each other and really making sense of the information together. You can also have them use it in groups if they're working in a team together. Some of our faculty have specific images or proofs or problems that they want them to annotate. So it does not have to be a textbook. It could be a PDF of a paper, a PDF of an image. You can also annotate video. So it does really have a lot of functionality. And I do encourage people as much as possible to be thinking about different ways that students can participate asynchronously, especially if you have people across different time zones. And I know annotation had, I think, the least number of people who were using it, but I'm wondering for people that have used annotation tools, which ones you've used, and if you had any successes or challenges that you've found with those annotation tools. Okay, so Sarah uses Perusal a lot and likes it. Oh, I haven't used Ziteboard. Somebody put that. Okay, thank you. So one of the other things I wanted to mention, I know that a number of people mentioned that they've used recorded lectures. And I know that, again, there are many different tools you can use for recorded lectures, but we use a tool called Panopto, and Panopto actually lets you embed different types of quizzes in videos. And so we still, really encourage videos to be between 5 and 7 minutes. Even at that length, sometimes it can be helpful to have students take a pause and do a self-check or answer some type of question. And it does have options for multiple choice or for longer types of questions. And another feature that it also has is a chat. So again, if you want students to be having a discussion about a specific video, it could be, for example, if you going over a homework problem or something like that. Panopto does have that option. We are also currently piloting a tool called Humanize, and Humanize also, a feature that has in it is the opportunity to annotate video and also to have a discussion about a specific video. But we've found that, especially some of our mathematics classes, using different options like this to be especially helpful for students. Okay, and then for the last few minutes, one of the things that I wanted to do was to have you. One of the other things I did want to mention was the different types of chat. So as you know, Zoom has a chat. Canvas also has a chat feature, but one of the things that I like to highlight about that is it only works if you are actually logged into Canvas. So like all the students would have to be logged into Canvas at the same time to use Canvas chat. But that can be a good backup. If you could tell students, if for some reason Zoom went down to meet in Canvas, for example. And Slack is also another option. We've had a lot of success with Slack, and a lot of our faculty, for those of you that have used Slack, you can set up different channels. So there could be a Q&A channel, a homework channel, a channel where students who want to create their own study group might connect in that space. And I would mention that, so like where we are, we use Canvas, and there is a Slack LTI for Canvas. Or you can use the free version of Slack, but if you choose to use the free version, to keep in mind that discussions don't get saved. So that, if there's information that you want people to refer back to, it would not get saved in Slack.
Once again, our thanks to you for coming, and hope you've enjoyed this. And thanks to Dr. Briscoe.
All right, thank you, everyone.